Welcome to the Adventures Club of Los Angeles. My name is Rich Mayfield, number 1211. I'm here tonight with Victor Vescovo. Now, Victor, thank you so much for coming. We appreciate you coming out. We're here tonight to talk about your Five Deeps expedition, but I want to kind of get to know who you are first and how you got to this point. So we always like to bring it back to the beginning. What gave you the bug to be an explorer or an adventurer? Like, what was the first thing that you did as a human being?
I was born. I think it's genetic. There are some interesting discussions during our expedition. We had some expedition doctors, and there is some literature out there saying that human beings fall on the spectrum of how adventurous, frankly, they are. There are some people that are very, very conservative in how they live, and then there are the ones that want to know what's on the other side of that hill, and the one after, and the one after. And, maybe we're the expendable ones that push us forward a bit. But I think I was born with all the copies of that gene. So I think the most dangerous thing that happened to me when I was young was my parents giving me my first bicycle when I was 6. And that's the last they saw of me for a while. So I think
you just took off and, you came back at dinner time, maybe.
Yeah, and I was born and raised in Texas. I'm a proud Texan. Apologies to all the Californians here. But being nice and flat allowed me to go for quite a distance.
That's interesting. So you bring up an interesting point. Not everybody is into adventure, and everybody's on the spectrum. How many people do you think are on the spectrum of adventure at your level in the world?
At my level? God help them. I would say a fraction of a percent. Because there's the other issue of, there's an axis of risk-taking. There's a very, very fine line between being really adventurous and being a successful explorer or adventurer and being reckless. Probably the most dangerous thing I've ever done in my life was high-altitude mountaineering for several decades. And it's a very, very fine line between having a good summit day and not coming back. And one of the key elements of adventure and exploring is being an absolute expert of risk management. Many people in this room, I'm sure, can appreciate that. If you don't do that correctly, you're just playing Russian roulette. And that's why I always come back.
So I think your resume kind of started with your Navy career. Did you join the Navy immediately after college or high school?
No,
or what was it?
The Navy thing kind of happened on the side. I was heavily involved in the mountain climbing, which is what I was primarily kind of doing my adventuring in my 20s and 30s. I was actually approached to join the Navy when I was in business school in Boston. And I speak a couple of languages. I'd done some mathematical simulations of warfare when I was at MIT, and the Navy contacted me and said, hey, we have this interesting program for guys like you. And would you like to get a commission and be an intelligence officer in the reserves? I went, okay. Sounds interesting. And 20 years later, I had been in the Navy for 20 years. First 10 years, I was a targeting officer. I was involved in the war in Kosovo and in Iraq. I was with Carrier Air Wing 9 off the Nimitz, and then 9/11 happened. And so for the next 10 years, especially because one of my languages is Arabic, I went into counterterrorism.
Interesting. So the Navy was kind of a side career for you. What was your primary career?
My primary career was business. So I started as a management consultant, and then eventually, really rapidly, I went into private equity and took other people's money and tried to make more of it by doing heavy industrial investments. My first big achievement was of course, being in Texas, was in an oil and gas company, and that did very well, but we also did a lot of basic industry type stuff, and that allowed me to found, with another individual, a private equity firm, and we did very, very well. And that allowed me to pursue my other passion, which I'd been developing from mountaineering, which was more intensive explorations, because when you start getting really, really high-end explorations, particularly in the ocean, it gets really expensive really fast.
So you did the Explorers Grand Slam.
Yeah.
So you hiked every mountain on every continent and skied to the North and South Pole.
Yes.
At that point, were you looking for a new adventure?
Yeah, in a way I was. And there's also, mountaineering, when you do it a lot, I mean, I got invited to go to K2, and that's when you have to start going, okay, am I a professional or not? And what is the risk that I'm willing to take? And I was getting older. And mountain climbing, in some respects, is a young person's game. It starts getting dangerous. And you can think you're going to be, immortal and live forever, but in the ultimate high-altitude mountains, it gets really, really dangerous, especially when your body starts to not be quite the same that it was in its late 20s and early 30s. So I said, what's a different adventure maybe that I could do?
A complete 180, one might say.
And what's kind of symmetrical, going up high? Oh, I could go down low. And then I heard about Richard Branson. who actually had what he called the 5 dives project to go to the bottom of all 5 of the world's oceans. But the technology that he chose was not really appropriate. It wouldn't work. It was carbon fiber, it was a quartz crystal canopy, and the project was abandoned. But I was sitting at my home in Dallas one day, and I kind of studied it. That's what I do when I'm bored. And I said, we have the technology to go to the bottom of the Mariana Trench. The Trieste did it in 1960, and James Cameron did it in 2012. We could do this. Why isn't it being done? And so I got a spreadsheet together. I talked to some people. I did some research, and I said, this is actually doable. But you have to build a new submersible, and you'd have to fund it. But fortunately, I had the means to do that. And so I made the decision. I just made the commitment. I said, if not me, who? No government's even trying to do this. And it's about time we went to the bottom of 4 of our world's 5 oceans.
So is the issue that the submersibles weren't reusable in a sense? Like,
okay,
it went down? Or?
Let's talk about Challenger Deep. That is one of the most brutal points on the planet. You're talking 16,000 pounds per square inch. It's like 4 automobiles on your fingernail on every single surface of the submersible. Freezing temperatures, corrosive salt water. Whenever you go down really deep, the environment is literally using God's own hammer to try and destroy whatever vehicle you're in. You can go into space, and with enough oxygen and supplies, you can stay in space for years. You cannot stay at the bottom of the ocean more than about 6 or 12 hours. It is slowly destroying the craft. That's why the Trieste only went down once. Deep Sea Challenger went down once. So we were trying to develop a submersible that could do it repeatedly and safely, which would allow us to go anywhere in the world. I'm motivated by technology. I like to push technology forward. I really wanted to build a door so that human beings could go anywhere on the seafloor repeatedly and safely. That was the real drive for me, was to do it. And I'm a pilot, so I wanted to pilot the damn thing. I can't believe that Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos don't go up. Well, Jeff did. Go up in their own rocket, right? I'd be the first one on it. But anyway, that's me.
So that's interesting because, these other submersibles, one off, one shot. How do you even get to the point where you can say this is safe enough for manned travel when it's never been down there before?
Math.
And you just really have to trust the math?
I was interviewed by a reporter once. He said, are you a really religious person, Victor? Did you have religious transformations on your experience? And I said, not really. I said, I really believe in 2 things, mathematics and titanium. and that's what allowed me to do the finite element analysis, the mathematical simulation of materials and structures under stress in silica that allowed us to have a very high confidence that it would survive. Because the first time my submersible, the limiting factor, dove to the bottom of Challenger Deep, that was the first time it had ever been fully assembled and dove to that depth. There is no pressure chamber on Earth large enough to test the full system. We had to test all the components, but not all together. And that, in some respects, is the real trick. And I was in it. But I was in it because I trusted the math and I trusted the engineers, and I also knew we had a lot of backups.
That's interesting because as an engineer, I'm the exact opposite. I don't trust the math. I want to see it. Show me.
Yeah.
All right, and do it again. Okay, now it's safe, right?
But
you can't do that for everything, right?
Well, no, but you can't. Otherwise, you're never going to get out of bed in the morning. I mean, you can't test everything to perfection. You test enough and repeatedly enough that you get a certain degree of confidence. Another question I got asked once was, okay, so what is your degree of confidence that you have to do something like that's that dangerous? And I said 90%. And they said, so let me get this straight. So you're willing to take like a 1 in 10 risk that you'll like not come back? And you would say, okay. And I said, yeah.
You sound like a guy that's taken more than 10 shots, though.
Correct, but it's the first one where it's 90-10.
Yeah.
Once it had done it, and once we got to know the characteristics, once it came back, we tore it apart, looked at it, what went right, what went wrong, the confidence interval goes up, just like an aircraft. The first time you fly an experimental aircraft is the most dangerous time to fly that aircraft.
Right.
After you've done it 10 or 12 times, it's not as dangerous. So it's the same principle.
So you had a picture in here. I want to advance to a couple slides of the actual, I would call it a schematic.
Yeah, there's the submersible, the limiting factor. So it started with 2 brilliant British designers, John Ramsey and Tom Blades, and they designed it so that it could go up and down in the water efficiently. That's why it looks the way it does. It doesn't look like a conventional submarine, But it was able to go laterally, in a reasonable amount. But it was primarily designed to do one thing, and that was to survive repeated journeys to the bottom of the ocean, wherever it may be.
That's interesting because, we've seen pictures of like Alvin, right? It's a famous one.
Right.
And it looks like a sub.
Correct.
That's meant to go forward.
Right.
But it didn't
Well, that's
go
a brilliant
forward.
example of human nature, where designers design things that they're familiar with. The two individuals that designed the limiting factor did not have a formal education in submarine design, but they did have an incredible background in material science and electronic systems. So they just took, what are the requirements that I
Right.
gave them? And from the requirements, they designed the optimal design.
And the fundamental requirement is it is going down.
Correct.
It's not a torpedo.
Correct.
Like every sub I've ever seen is a torpedo.
Right. And just think about the design. It's actually has a perfect center of gravity. It's not weighted heavily on one end with the pressure capsule that's really heavy and you have to balance it on the other end. It's inherently stable.
Right. So it's interesting. You named this limiting factor, which is totally an engineer's thing. So what was the limiting factor in this whole project?
The limiting factor was simply how to design systems that could survive the beating it took at the ultimate depth. The gaskets, the small interfaces, those are always the weak points. And that pressure, over time, will find the weakest point in that submersible. If you have 1,000 points of vulnerability on a submersible like this, nature will immediately go to the weakest one and just start pounding it. But the name, the limiting factor, actually comes from the name of a starship in my favorite science fiction series, The Culture, by Scottish author Ian Banks, if any of you are familiar with him. So it's an homage to him. Actually, the ships that Elon Musk lands the Falcon 9 rockets on are also named from the same series. So there's
It's some real deep nerd stuff right there. I love it.
Oh,
So in the center is this titanium sphere.
correct.
That you had built. Now,
Two-person. Yeah, the first submarine that went down was a two-person sphere, but it was made out of steel, which is why the Trieste was enormous. It was actually using gasoline as its buoyancy because gasoline is lighter than salt water, but it was really heavy. But it really couldn't move. So when Don went down to the bottom of the ocean, and he was a good friend of mine, they went down, they were only down there for like 10 or 15 minutes and came right back up. They didn't maneuver at all. It was just too unwieldy to maneuver that massive craft. It had to be towed out to the Mariana Trench. James Cameron had the Deep Sea Challenger. That was also a steel material. It's cheaper, it's highly characterized, we know how it operates, but it had to be small. So Jim actually was like this, for the entire journey up and down because they couldn't make it much bigger or it would have been too heavy, they couldn't have carried on the back. I really wanted to have a pilot and a scientist on board, and that was one of my design requirements. They said, well, that's going to be a lot harder. You won't be able to use steel or it would be enormous. You'd have to tow it, and that has a whole lot of problems. And we settled on titanium. The biggest issue with titanium, it is really hard to machine. That takes time, but most of all, it's incredibly expensive. So I wrote the check.
So I kind of want to know about that check. So just the
Most people do.
titanium sphere there. How much was that tiny titanium sphere?
It was about 12 million,
And what was the total cost of the submersible?
35.
So a little bit less than half.
Yeah.
And what did they deliver you? Just a sphere with nothing?
No, they developed a fully machined sphere and probably the most complex part of the entire submersible, which were the 3 windows. And we had huge arguments over how many windows to have, because the Trieste and the Deep Sea Challenger only had one, because that is a key vulnerability of the submersible. You don't go poking holes in the pressure hull. They wanted 3, and they being Triton. They said, no, you need one to look down, and you need one for the passenger and one for the pilot. I went, okay. But we figured out how to do it. So when they delivered the titanium sphere, it had 6 penetrations. It had the 3 windows. It had 2 for the electrical conduits, which were frankly easier to develop than the viewports, and then the hatch. The Trieste had a hatch. Deep Sea Challenger didn't have a hatch. They bolted Jim into it. I wasn't going to have that. And
You wanted to be able to pop the hatch.
which I could, and that was an emergency scenario. If anything had gone terribly wrong, I would have been able to get to the surface, pop the hatch, and get out, and have a GPS, telephone, and get me out of there. So it's just a different evolution.
Did you get pushback on that requirement? That's an interesting requirement. I want to be able to pop the hatch. by
No,
myself.
actually, they insisted, because this was the first submersible that could go to the bottom of the ocean that was commercially certified. by DNV, the German-Norwegian firm that actually makes something commercially safe, like an airliner. And they said, no, you need to be able to get out. You can't be bolted into something that's commercially certified. So and that added another 6 months or 10 months to the design and certification, and probably added another 30% to the cost to make it that safe. That's why Prince Albert of Monaco went in the sub with me to the bottom of the Mediterranean. That's why Kathy Sullivan, the first woman to the bottom, got in it with very few questions. This was a commercially certified, tested device that was inherently safe. In fact, the third dive to the bottom of the ocean in this submersible was done by Patrick Leahy, the guy who designed and built it, and the German lead engineer for submersibles from Germany. That was one of their requirements, was that one of their guys had to go down in it and test it. He wanted to. It wasn't put a gun to his head.
Yeah, he didn't put a gun to his head.
Yeah.
So how many times has it been down?
The limiting factor has been down to the bottom of the ocean, I believe, 22 times.
And do you guys have some math that predicts its lifespan, or how many cycles it
The
can do?
titanium sphere, the pressure hull, is designed to withstand up to 10,000 dives.
Interesting.
But we basically had to replace certain components of it after every 5 dives, every 10. Here's a little funny story. DNV that certified the submersible, they said, yeah, after every deep dive, you have to log it, and when you get to about 25, you have to tear it apart, check everything, and then put it back together, et cetera. That's one of our requirements. I said, okay, but what counts as a deep dive? And they thought about it. They said, about 4,000 meters. I went, okay, so all of our dives to the Titanic, they didn't even count because it wasn't deep enough.
That's an easy
okay,
one.
that's kind of cool.
So what kind of, you did some testing on the titanium sphere
Yeah.
to start, right?
Yeah, there's only one place in the world we could pressure test the pressure vessel, which was the biggest component of the sub. And that was at the Krylov Institute in St. Petersburg, Russia.
Okay.
And that was at a sketchy time. And so we actually put the pressure vessel in a container in Poland. We drove it to Poland on a Friday. We paid in cash, and we tested it on a Saturday and got it out on a Sunday.
Were you worried that, like, if it passed, they'd
We were
keep it, or what?
extremely worried that they were going to keep it, or that they were going to put $1 million export tax on it. We didn't know we had the pressure vessel back until they cracked open the container in Florida, and there it was. We thought it could have been a lot of bricks.
Huh.
Yeah. Welcome to Russia.
So there's a facility in, you said St. Petersburg?
No, actually, it was the production facility in Sebastian, Florida, where Triton is based. So
where the test facility was.
St. Petersburg, Russia, yeah.
So there's a test facility. How deep was that able to test it?
It was able to test it to 20% greater than about 14,000 meters. In fact, there was so much energy in the system when they tested the pressure vessel to that depth that they said if there had been a catastrophic failure in the mechanism, it would have leveled the entire building. So it was the deepest they had ever tested anything, and we're talking Russia.
Well, I got to ask, how much did that test cost? Did you have to have insurance on it?
Are you serious? This was so non-insurable. It was ridiculous.
Well,
this
like,
was
you know,
all
like
cash on a weekend.
But
when was the last time you got insured for something like that?
So you're taking this to this building full of scientists, and you're saying, test
It was
my
totally
test
on the
my
down
sphere.
low. This was a bunch of Russian guys that were trying to make money to pay the light bill, and they didn't want their own authorities finding out about it. So yeah.
So basically, if it had imploded or something,
I mean, we're talking to yeah, can we come? Yes, you come. Yeah, you can come. We can test it. You have cash? Like, yeah, we got cash. It's like, okay, can we come up on a Friday and be out by Sunday? Yes, we can make this work. Do you have cash? You know?
So if it goes bad, just everybody walks away.
Yeah, pretty much.
Nothing happened.
Yeah. And they're like, who's going to come? Is Victor going to come? No, don't bring Victor. No, this is not good. We just come very quiet,
So you had it tested, so you know that your sphere, and when you tested it, did it have all the through-hole penetrations already in
Yeah.
it? Like it,
Yep. Yeah,
so
we
that's
had
your
it
key test to give you confidence
Yep.
that at least you're safe.
Well,
in
that
your,
as well.
in your
The
ball.
other key design requirement that I gave the designers was the laws of physics would have to be violated for me not to come back. And I know that's incredible, but they kind of had that in mind. So literally, I had to struggle to figure out ways for the submersible to fail so that I could not come back. The most dangerous dive I probably did was at the Titanic. People go, well, why? It's not that deep. The most risky thing that can happen in a submersible is entanglement, okay? And at the Titanic, you have three bad combinations. The currents can be very strong. stronger than the maximum power output of the submersible. So you're no longer in control if you get caught in a really
You got
tight
this
current.
big pillow.
Number
floating
two,
through.
right? Number two, the wreck is big. It is a really big wreck, which means there's a lot of potential areas where you can get impaled or something else. Number three, it has a lot of cables and ropes. And you're always trying to get closer to get the best possible video for Discovery Channel. So there were times when I was near the railing where actually the currents would just come out of nowhere and kind of push you towards or even into the wreck. That happened once. And if you ever got entangled, that's a really bad day because the submersible was designed, according to DNVGL, where everything had to be able to be ejectable if it could have become entangled. The thrusters, the manipulator arm, if this and that. But if that happened, your life depends on a single switch working. And you never want to put yourself in that position. So it was a mistake probably to dive the Titanic solo because you need two pairs of eyes. One set of eyes inside looking at the sonar, looking at where you are, another set of eyes looking at the wreck, looking at the hazards. And doing both in a strong current was incredibly stressful. I never did it again, and it was really sketchy.
So I think I heard something there. Did you hit the Titanic?
Okay.
Have you touched the Titanic? That's another way, but
I mean, they made it sound like I sank it again, okay? But when you dive in the Titanic, you need to get a permit from the federal government because they passed a congressional law saying you need to. It's a British wreck in international waters. Why do I need an American permit? But that's just the rules. One of the rules is you don't touch the wreck unless you have authorization. And they said you can survey it, but you can't touch it. So, I mean, I'm going around the wreck. I'm right next to it and this, that, and the other. Yeah, current. And I bumped a railing, and it was on video. And I had to download my whole report, and I had to give NOAA and the feds the video. Oh my God, he touched the wreck, oh my Lord. I was hauled into federal court in Norfolk, Virginia, before a judge to explain myself of why we allowed the submersible to hit the wreck. So the only time I've ever been prosecuted for a moving violation was when I hit the Titanic with my submersible.
Well done. How exactly does...
And the judge was like, really, that's it? That's all you did? And like, yes, Judge, you're dismissed. So
Did he just ask to shake your hand and you'd be on your way?
she just looked disgusted and went, really? Why did you? Yeah.
I've got better stuff to deal with.
Yeah.
So
A submarine version of it, yeah, I did.
how exactly does the U.S. have any sort of jurisdiction over the Titanic?
Well, there's a rationale to it. The Brits, the Canadians, and the Americans, they didn't want people going to the wreck and pillaging it. So they passed a federal U.S. law saying that you need a permit, and if you go and pillage the Titanic without a permit from the U.S., then technically that's a violation of our laws. So if you ever come to the U.S., Canada, or the U.K., you could be arrested. So it acts as a deterrent.
Interesting.
But if I was from Serbia and I wanted to go plunder the Titanic and I never went to the U.S., yeah, you could go do that. But there aren't that many submersibles that can get down that deep, and it's a big operation to bring stuff up.
Yeah, and you mentioned that, so it's interesting, this whole project, you said the submersible
Oh, there's
itself
the Titanic, yeah.
was $35 million
Yeah,
to build the submersible.
yeah.
What was the total cost of the entire project?
For 4 years,
Yeah.
a lot more.
So you had
The dirty secret of deep ocean exploration is, okay, the cost of the vessels is extremely high. The operations and maintenance of a 24/7 operation for marine exploration is extremely high, which is why it is so rare. It's very expensive, and governments even have a hard time rationalizing it. And private individuals, it's extremely rare. There are only a handful of private individuals, like Ray Dalio with OceanX, Kel Roki of Rev Ocean, or Eric Schmidt of Schmidt Ocean. I mean, it's like on one hand. And then
Right.
what I did it for 4 straight years, but I was very thankful that Gabe Newell, the American billionaire who founded the Steam Gaming Network, bought my entire system, hired my entire crew, and has funneled an enormous amount of money into the exact same system, and they're diving in the Pacific and in the Antarctic doing the science missions. I'm incredibly thankful for him to do that. That's what I wanted. But now that allows me the liberty to learn from everything we did for 4 years and try and develop the next generation submersible that will be even more capable than the limiting factor. I mean, typical engineer, God, I've got this list of all the things I would change about the original,
So when you were starting, I want to backtrack a little bit. You were basically calling these guys, and I've come up with a scenario in which I could kill myself. What is our solution to make sure that that doesn't happen?
It wasn't that way at all. I had the idea, hey, this is doable to do the 5 deeps with a reusable submersible. The only people in the world that I thought remotely could do it were Triton Submarines in Florida. So I contacted Patrick Leahy, the president. He was like, yes, this is going to be awesome. We've been wanting to do this for 10 years. And so then we started. And it was a great interplay between the designers, Patrick, myself, developing the submersible. You needed someone, that really believed to pull this off, because there were a lot of people saying that this was a foolhardy. Look, one thing that I think people don't fully appreciate, maybe people here at the Adventurers Club and true explorers get it. After you've done it, it's like, oh, well, yeah, great, that's awesome. We had no idea that this was going to be successful. I undertook this mission, I wrote those checks with zero assurance that it was actually going to work. The embedded journalist that we had on the expedition, Josh Young, who wrote the book, Expedition Deep Ocean, he said it was the hardest book he ever wrote. I asked him why. He said, I had no idea how it was going to end. And I was right in the middle of it. I didn't know either. And there were several times where I didn't know if it was going to work. But 2020 hindsight, it makes it look easy. And it's not. It's really, really hard.
I mean, the path is clear when you look behind you, right? So you had this bug, 5 deeps, and you had to go to this company. You had to find a company who could build you a submersible, because everything. I'm sure you, like you said, you did the spreadsheets. You looked at everything. I need to build my own submersible.
Right, and other people had tried and failed. Richard Branson, who's richer than I am, he tried and it didn't work out. I mean, you had to be very careful, very methodical. But that's what I do.
How long did it take these guys to design this submersible?
A year.
That's fast.
That's private sector. Oh, well, let me give you an example of the difference between, for all of my friends here in California, let me give you an example of the efficiency and speed and cost effectiveness of private sector versus government. This actually happened. I was sitting at my desk in Dallas one day where I live, I'm native, and I was working on business stuff, and I got a call from Triton. They said, oh, there's a detail we need to nail. We need to get it like now because of a bunch of other stuff. Where do you want the stick shift that controls the maneuverability of the submersible? You're the pilot. What is optimal for you? We can put it on the left, we can put it on the right. How high do you want it? This type of everything. And we talked about it for about 15 minutes, some really rough pros and cons, made a decision within 15 minutes, done, that's it. How long would that have taken? How many committees would you have had to go through to decide where to put the primary control mechanism for a $35 million submersible? It would have taken months. It would have taken so much more time and money, and it probably would have been suboptimal.
Yeah.
Because it would have been a decision made by committee. That's the difference at the most fundamental level between private sector and government. But this was extraordinary because I was not only the person writing the checks, I was setting the requirements, and I was the bloody pilot. That's a really, really tight decision cycle.
Right.
And that's why you're able to do things quickly and effectively.
And how many engineers do you think touched this project over the course of a year?
Oh, God, 50? All the different components, subcomponents, electrical engineers, mechanical engineers, block and tackle guys of how to get it on and off the ship. It was very involved. We had up to 50 people on the ship that you can see there at one time. Combination of technicians, ship's crew, film crew, scientists, sonar operators, you name it.
And then was that build time included, or design time was a year?
Design time, strictly design.
And then how long was the build?
2 years to build.
2 years to build it.
And then 6 months to test. But really, the testing took a year and a half. The 5 Deeps expedition was effectively a shakedown cruise of the ship and the submersible, where we figured out what went right, what went wrong. There you can see the map. We took it around the world. I figured, hell, if you're going to do a shakedown cruise, do it right. Let's go to the bottom of all 5 oceans. The funniest thing that happened when we were planning this mission, we brought the scientists on board, and idiot me, I thought, oh, well, we know where the bottoms are at least, right? We've mapped the seafloor. And Heather Stewart, a geologist from the Royal Geological Society, raised her hand. She said, Victor, actually, we're not exactly sure where the bottom parts of 4 of the 5 oceans are. We know Challenger Deep pretty well, but we're not sure of the other 4. I said, what do you mean? He says, you're going to have to map them first to know where to dive. I went, really? Okay, what do I need for that? She said, you need a really big sonar. I went, okay. So in about 6 months, we bought the most advanced sonar ever put on a civilian vessel, a Kongsberg EM-124. I bought serial number 1. And we actually debugged it and tested it also on the 5 deeps, but we were able to identify the deepest points in all 5 oceans, which wasn't easy.
Now, was that real time? You had
Yeah.
The submersible on the back,
Pretty much. The
and you
submersible-
surveyed, and you're like, that looks like
Yeah,
it.
we had to
Let's
take
go.
it. We had to take it to Curacao to build a gondola for the sonar, install it, and then on the first dive in the Puerto Rican Trench was when we were testing and qualifying the sonar. I mean, this was all really breakneck speed, really fast and loose. I mean, no way this would have happened in the government. But it was my ship, and I was paying for it, and people were like going, okay, why not?
Let's go.
Always hire really young people. They have no idea what's impossible.
Yeah. They work long hours too, right?
Right.
But that is fascinating.
Oh, and by the way, the best way ever to motivate engineers, it's a little secret I learned in business and in this type of stuff, was if an engineer ever gave me too much, I'm not sure we can do that, this and that, that's okay. I know this other team.
Yeah.
I think they have a way to do it. That's okay.
Yeah.
No,
we got it. We got it.
Yeah. Then like, no, I can figure it out.
I think it helps that you're doing something really freaking cool
Well,
too, right?
when you're also doing something that's breaking barriers, that's what every engineer, lives to do, is to build something that's never been built before, that's doing something extreme. And God forbid you say someone else might be able to do it better than you. Then
faster
Then
first,
they won't sleep for like 5 days to get it done.
Right.
And that's what I needed, and that's what we got done.
So take us forward to, or wherever we're at in this talk, setting out on this expedition. So you got your ship.
Yep.
You got the limiting factor on the back.
Yeah, the first solo dive I ever did was to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean in the limiting factor. And the 36 hours prior to that, lots of things broke. It was very unclear if we were going to be successful. I was this close to hitting the pause button for a year, which would have been a disaster financially and to morale. But then I said, you got 36 hours. And, taking some of my business training, I left them alone. I literally went into my cabin on the ship, and I didn't come out for like a day. I just let them go at it. And then finally, Patrick came into my cabin. He said, I think we got it. I think we've got you a sub that can dive. And I went, okay. And
What was broke? I think that's important.
Oh, so many things. Electrical systems had been shorted out. The manipulator arm had fallen off in a previous dive. There was all sorts of stuff. But I said, focus on the core elements I need to go down and come back up successfully. And that's what they did. They basically hot-wired the sub, but they did it really well. And so I had a completely uneventful dive. But it was my first solo dive. It was to 8,000 plus meters, 2/3 of full ocean depth. That's when we kind of knew we had something. But then the next dive was, in the photograph that you see, was off of the Southern Ocean. That's South Georgia Island, one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen, where Shackleton is buried. And we spent a month in the Southern Ocean getting the hell beat out of us. We actually had a collision between the sub and the ship at one point, which was not cool. But no one had even remotely mapped the South Sandwich Trench before. It was completely virgin territory. And no one had ever found the deepest point in the Southern Ocean. We mapped it, and we found it. And on the one day we had a successful dive, I dove solo down to the bottom of the Southern Ocean. And at 4,000 meters, I lost all comms with the surface because of a very thick thermocline, a temperature differential in the water, and it cut off all acoustic communications with the ship. So I had a decision.
And when you communicate, you're not tethered, right?
Not tethered, nope.
So the communication with the surface
All acoustic.
is just acoustic?
Yeah, people don't realize often that radio doesn't work underwater. So
Sure.
we're using an acoustic telephone built by L3 Harris. It was basically a military system. And it was traveling at the speed of sound. So actually at the bottom of the ocean, it takes 7 seconds for transmissions to go from the surface to the very bottom of the ocean. You can talk to the moon faster than you can talk to someone at the bottom of the ocean.
How did the sonar work?
The sonar was a multi-beam echo sounder. So it was a gondola that was about 10 meters long, 5 meters wide, and it had transmit and receiver nodes. So it would send sound waves down to the bottom of the ocean, and line by line, it would map the bottom of the ocean. And we would do that kind of in real time, and then they'd produce the maps. They'd go, where do you want to dive? I want to dive there. And that's what we would do. But in the Southern Ocean, I went down below 4,000 meters, lost comms. Procedure in submarines, and there's some submarine people out here, is that if you lose communications for more than 30 minutes, you come up. Well, this was a special situation. We were in a very remote place. It was like the one day we were able to dive. I said, when am I coming back to the Southern Ocean? So I made the call to keep going down. Everything else was fine with the sub. I just couldn't talk to the surface. I didn't really need them anyway. I was autonomous. So I kept going down, got down to about 6,500, got to the bottom of the Southern Ocean, which was just awesome. It was amazing. Stayed down for 1 hour, and then I came back up. And then at 4,000 meters, so we got comms again. So they were really upset with me when I got to the surface.
They left.
Although one of the engineers, he took me aside later that night and he said, "Nah, I knew you were okay." I went, "Really? How did you know I was okay? You didn't hear from me." He said, "If you'd had imploded, we would have heard it."
Yeah.
I was like, "Oh, great, thanks."
So I kind of want you to.
Oh, by the way, the deepest point in the Southern Ocean is now named the Factorian Deep after the submarine. That's traditional. Yeah.
I want you to kind of take us through a dive because, a lot of what we see, we can kind of imagine, we've seen images at the bottom, right, around the Titanic or, the crazy alien landscape of the ocean floor. And we see you, bobbing around the surface. What's it like after the point? So you drop the submersible in the water. I'm not sure how you get over there on a skiff or something, but
Nope, I'm in the sub when they put it in the water.
Okay, so you're in there and you close that hatch and you're bobbing at the surface.
Yep.
Tell us what it's like once you descend past like 5 feet or something.
Okay, well, first of all,
clear the surface.
The whole process is very methodical. I've been a pilot since I was 19 years old, and I stressed over and over again, I want every single dive to be as boring as possible.
Checklist.
Checklist after checklist. You make your plan, you stick to it. Yeah, things happen, and you adapt, just like being in a plane. And so, you prep the dive the day before. I personally inspected the sub before every dive I made, checking every gasket, every potential major failure point. Yeah, I did it myself. It's how you fly. Get in the sub, they lower it in the water, and then they're looking for other craft, all this other stuff, and then they tow me right over the point where they wanted me to dive, where I wanted to dive. And then we go through the checklist, and they say, "You're clear to dive." I open the buoyancy tanks, water comes in, and then very gently, it starts slowly going into the water. And after about 5 feet, it starts accelerating a little bit, about 1.3 meters per second. And then, you start dropping pretty rapidly. I mean, most military submarines can probably go down to 400 or 500 meters. I went through that in like a couple of minutes. And at about 1,000 meters, it starts getting dark. And after 1,000 meters, it's completely dark. At 6,000 meters, which few people can say they've been to, but when you get to 6,000 meters, the scientists tell me photons cannot go below that. So when you're looking out of the viewports below 6,000 meters, you are looking into absolute void. In fact, it actually gives you a bit of vertigo if you stare into it. It's almost like the Nietzschean thing, right? Be careful when you're staring into the abyss. The abyss is looking back into you. And it was very strange to see that, but it's the ultimate black.
So what, you described the visual, what does it sound like?
Oh, well, the first couple of dives, it sounded awful because I didn't know my craft. And any pilot out there will tell you, it's like every plane, every vehicle, even your own car, right? They all have their own unique sounds. So every time my submersible made a sound when I was first test flying it, it freaked me out. Like, oh shit, what's that? Oh Lord, what's that? But I got to know it after a while. In fact, there was a funny situation where the pressure capsule was actually bolted together. So to keep it in perfect sphericity, they wrapped a steel cable around it under very high tension. That kept it tight and in the sphere when we were lowering it into the ocean and bringing it back out. The engineers thought that over the distance traveling down the bottom of the ocean, that coil would compress into the sphere. Unpredictably, we found out that no, it was a stepwise function, which meant on one of my dives, I went like past 7,000 feet, and then it was very quiet. The fans are whirring, circulating the air to get rid of the carbon dioxide. A couple of little, whooshing sounds of the water, and then out of nowhere, right under me, I heard this big thump. I'm like, oh crap. But Don Walsh told me, he said, if you ever hear anything in a deep diving submersible, you're okay. Said, it's when you don't that you're gonna, not come back.
The first time though, it
scared the hell out of me.
Yeah.
But I just kept going. I didn't even know what it was. I didn't know what it was until I brought it back up, and I asked them, and they said that's the only thing it could have been. So whenever I took a passenger down after that, I wouldn't tell them that was coming. And so it was about half the time it happened, and it was kind of funny when it did. They're like, oh my God, what's that? And I went, nah.
So going back to the map, the first dive was where again?
The Puerto Rican Trench. The
Okay.
second dive was to the Southern Ocean. That was really tough. That's when the crew really came together under very high adversity. The next dive was, well, it wasn't clear where the deepest point in the Indian Ocean was. That was still a mystery. We've solved it now. It could have been the Diamantina fracture zone off the coast of Australia, or it could have been off the Java Trench. And we ended up diving on both, and it turned out that the Java Trench was deeper by about 100 meters. So it's really close. And the biggest barrier to deep ocean exploration is not the technology, it's not even the money, it's government permitting. The Indonesians said that the Java Trench was within their exclusive economic zone, which it is, and they said we needed a permit to dive there. So for a year and a half, I worked with the Indonesians to get a permit. And everything was great. They were all smiles. They said permit was coming. Finally got over to Indonesia, no permit yet, no permit. We got right over the deepest point in the Indian Ocean, still no permit, and I had to make the call. Do we dive or not? Do we wait for a permit? Technically, according to the UN law of the sea, you do not need a permit if all you're doing is going down and coming back up. You're testing your equipment, you're a tourist, you're not touching anything, you're not taking anything. It's not 100% clear if that's considered marine science or not, but by most conventional definitions, it is not. So I got in the sub, dove to the bottom of the Java Trench. It was the deepest point. We came back up. The next day, the Indonesians transmitted to us that our permit had been denied on national security grounds and that we had violated their sovereignty. They even, several months later, passed a law making it a crime in Indonesia to do what we did. So now I was a pirate. We could not go back to Indonesia. They were probably going to impound the ship. And so we said, well, where can we go? We're literally looking at the map. We've only got like a third of our fuel left. This is during the height of COVID. We're like going, where do we go? We can't go to Indonesia, and Indonesia's big. We can go to Australia. No, they're going to intern us for 4 weeks. They're paranoid of COVID. We can't go there. Can't make it to India. Oh, let's go to East Timor, that old Portuguese pirate haven. So we started steaming to East Timor. I came out on deck that night, and the crew was flying a pirate flag off the back of the ship. And I said, oh, man. I go up to the captain, hey, captain, yeah. The boys put a pirate flag. 2 questions. Boys put a pirate flag on the back of the ship. You're going to take that down before we go into East Timor port, right? He said, yeah, we'll take that. The boys are just having some fun. He's Scottish, And I said, the second question, probably more important, is why is there a pirate flag on my ship? He said, Victor, us Scots, you scratch a Scot, you find a pirate. Okay. Fair enough.
That's interesting. Like, I hear all this stuff about how the U.S. Navy enforces like freedom of navigation and all that stuff. Did you have any did you feel, where was your vessel flagged, first of all? Was it a U.S. flag vessel?
U.S. territory, so we're Marshall Islands.
Okay.
So we had the protection of the U.S., but we were not American, because having an American flag would have caused more problems than even a different flag. It gets really tricky.
Did you feel like you had any backup going, like, Indonesia's going to...
I was 20 years in U.S. Navy. I have friends, and
I feel like
they were watching. They were watching the ship and yeah.
Yes.
We knew if someone was coming after us.
That's good. And did you ever feel like the Indonesian government was coming after you? Talking.
I cannot go back to Indonesia.
No. Some of the best stories end like that, and I can't go back to that country anymore.
I've been to Bali once. I'm not going to go again, but I'm good. So,
after like this is such an incredible venture, right? To dive all these. When you did.
And right after that, we went to Challenger Deep. So then it's like, okay, now we got the big show. Now we're not just going to dive to the bottom of the ocean. We're going to do it multiple times, which no one had done before. So I mean, the tension level went up a lot. Was that the most tense dive that you did? Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's the first time you go down, and you go down to that depth, it's like if something bad's going to happen, it's going to happen there. But Don Walsh came on board, and he was there with us, and he gave some good pep talks and, gave me some advice and this, that, and the other. He was also the first person that congratulated me when I came out of the hatch from the first dive.
That's
and
pretty
then
cool.
And then 3 days later, we did it again. That actually might have been a little bit more worrisome, was doing it the second time. Because you're like, okay, no one's ever done this twice. I wonder if there's a reason. But it went off without a hitch.
But you had all those other dives under your belt, right?
Yeah, but not to Mariana Trench, not to 11,000 meters, 10,935. Yeah.
And what percentage in terms of pressure, depth pressure, same thing, but like what?
It was, well, if the bottom of the Atlantic was 8,000 meters, this was about 50% more. So it's just an insane amount of pressure. Yep.
That's it.
Yep.
It's pretty
And here we
serious.
have actually, we made the sonar map of the Mariana Trench. No one had really done that with modern equipment. There were some maps before that, but we did it with an EM-124. So this was by far the most detailed map of the Challenger Deep ever built. I took down 3 robots with me that acted as navigation beacons, cameras. They took scientific data. We assaulted the Mariana Trench with more technology than anyone had ever done before. And so, I knew where I was. We did it multiple times. That's why we knew the characterization of the Challenger Deep. And that's what we do. And there are 3 pools to the Challenger Deep, the eastern, central, and western pools. Don dove in the western pool. Jim dove in the eastern pool, a little bit north of where I dove. And we did all 3 over time.
And explain your robot buddies that you take down with you. I think there's some pictures of these robots out there.
Yeah, there's a picture. So the landers did the heavy lifting on the side. So we built these landers that we would deploy over the side. There's one of them, Closby, on the bottom of the Mariana Trench. They had cameras. They took water samples. They had baited traps so they could take pictures of the animals that we'd see down there. And we were able to create kind of an acoustic GPS where we could ping the landers that we knew their locations after many hours and figure out where the sub was in relation to them. So we would know where the sub was on the bottom of the ocean and I could navigate. So that was very important. Although I have to confess, on the very first dive to the Mariana Trench, all 3 landers went down. And one of the backup systems we had to make sure the landers came back was that it had a dissolvable cable. And they had done a mathematical analysis of how long the cables would last, so we made the cables that long. And of course, no one tested them, because how can you test them for the bottom of the ocean? So on my first dive to the bottom of the Challenger Deep, I'm at like 8,000 meters, and I saw all of a sudden get a call from the surface saying, Victor, yeah, all 3 landers are coming up. One of them was on the exact same coordinates I was diving. So I swear to God, I'm going, you've got to be kidding me. I'm about to have a midair with a lander in the bottom of the Mariana Trench.
But, big ocean, right? So probably not.
It passed 50 meters to my left. I saw the light come up. And I was like, oh, you got to be kidding me. But anyway, so they weren't there for my first dive. But the first dive was simply getting there safely.
Yeah.
I got to the very bottom of the Mariana Trench on my first dive. I got to the bottom. I'm like, oh, my God, this is awesome. I'm still here. The craft works. It's in great condition. Like, what do I do? So I just tooled around for like 4 hours, cruising around the bottom of the Mariana Trench because it was fun.
It looks like the moon, but you can play golf
I felt like I was
like
7
that,
years old again. It was great. And we eventually, we got a little more serious when we were not focused completely on the sub. We recovered the first rock from the Serena Deep. That was from like 10,900 meters. And then we brought it back. And when we actually put it under an electron microscope, we actually saw colonies of bacteria. Now, this is life that is existing without photosynthesis. They're living off chemosynthesis. They're taking the methane and the chemicals from the rocks, and that's providing their entire existence. So if there's life on other planets, it's going to look more like that than it does up here on land. So I think we have some slides on that. Show the next slide. That shows where we got the rock. The gold area, that's the bacterial colonies. They're colored gold. Not that they care because there's no light down there, but that's just the color. And then the next slide shows, under the electron microscope, the colonies of the animals. So that is completely otherworldly. And it was just such a privilege to be able to bring stuff like that back.
Were they sequenced?
Yes, they are being sequenced.
Are they a new species?
Yes, every single dive we made into the deep trenches, we discovered new species because no one had ever been there. And they'd been developing for 40 million years. So, of course, there would be different species. That was one thing that was great about exploring. No one had ever been to these places, even remotely.
So,
By the way, the average place on Earth, if you took the highs and lows, the average depth of the ocean, the average place on Earth is about 3,500 feet underwater and completely dark. That's the average place on our planet, not the land.
Yeah, so you mentioned, you went to all these places, right? And from what I understand, you've sold all this stuff now. What's the idea behind that? Why do all this and then sell it?
Well, I mentioned it earlier. The cost of maintaining and operating a completely well-outfitted deep ocean expeditionary system is prodigiously expensive. I am not a billionaire, but that's what it takes to do that, okay? It is a lot. And so I was very happy. What I like doing most is technological development, test pilot stuff. And I did that. I did it for 4 years. And we perfected the limiting factor after the amount of time. All the stuff that was a little sketchy, we fixed it, we reinvigorated, and then, like I said, it was great.
And the major innovation is being able to go up and down repeatedly, 10,000.
We made it normal. I mean,
Right.
we started calling it the elevator because that's what it was like, getting in an elevator and going down wherever we wanted. But what I wanted to do was get a lot of my capital back and stop the burn so I could apply those resources to developing new technology. The next submersible I'm developing now would have new technology that the limiting factor doesn't have. It would have a sonar system that can look out 5 to 10 times further. Instead of having a hydraulic manipulator arm, which failed half the time, I'm now investing with some universities to develop a manipulator arm based off of carbon fiber and artificial muscle that's electrically stimulated, that would be impervious to pressure. That doesn't exist, but I need money to develop that.
I think we talked about this, but why is it that hydraulics are susceptible
Hydraulics
to?
work on pressure.
Right.
So this is something that you take at sea level that's working at 1 atmosphere, but then you're taking it down to, okay. When you go from sea level at 1 atmosphere to outer space, you're going from 1 atmosphere to 0, a vacuum. When you go to Challenger Deep, you're going from 1 atmosphere to 1100.
Right.
Hydraulics fail in that environment almost routinely. Even Jim's manipulator arm failed. They just do. Because the pressure differentials are just too high.
Is it just all the bubbles in the system that you would bleed it out, but it's like a microscopic by the time you put it down there?
And you're putting it in freezing cold conditions, and it's the gaskets that fail. Those gaskets are moving under intense pressure with differential pressure between what's inside and outside. So it would work for like 4 or 5 minutes, and then it would just go, and then it's useless. So you need something that is not based on hydraulics, and that's one of the things. The other thing I want to do is we have the technology now, I want to put cameras outside the sub that have 8K resolution, and then having a direct fiber optic feed into the sub with a curvilinear display that matches the hull of the submersible.
Oh, yeah.
So that it is basically a virtual window. When you're looking at the screen, it's like you're looking through the hull. They have that on the F-35 fighter, and I want to put it in a submersible. These are all the things I want to do, but it takes capital and it takes time. It'll take me 4 or 5 years to design and develop the next gen sub, but people never see the hard work, the time that it takes to build all the stuff, to do the planning. They only see when you pop out of the hatch and go, yay.
It's a lot of engineering, right?
Yeah, but I like that part.
So what's your engineering team look like right now?
It's in flux. There's a lot of movement in the submersible space between different companies being bought and sold. The people that designed my submersible were acquired by Inkfish. Inkfish also wants to build a next generation submersible. They want to do in a little bit different way that I don't want to get into. It's just a different level of technology, maybe a bit exotic compared to what I would do, but that's what they're doing.
And who bought the limiting factor?
Gabe Newell and his team.
And what's he up to?
Well, no, as I mentioned, they're doing the explorations in the Pacific and the Antarctic, and they're doing it pretty intensively. So I'm also very concerned with doing mapping. 75% of the seafloor is completely unmapped. So if you do the math, half of planet Earth is still completely unexplored. So I'm developing a ship that would probably be the most efficient deep ocean mapping vessel ever constructed. I'm hoping to have that in 2 years. I'm also trying to develop landers that can be deployed much more easily to take components down for testing. So yeah, I'm involved in a lot. And I'm using satellites now to map coastal areas. That's something that's new as well. We can use satellites to map coastal areas to a depth of 30 meters. We can do that with a combination of new technologies. So just last year, we were able to map 250,000 square kilometers of coastal areas that had never been mapped before.
And is that just a function of the image processing that's available now that you can actually...
What they'll do is they'll take image after image of these areas, then they'll be able to get rid of the clouds, and then they'll analyze the light coming through the water with multiple images, and from that they can stereoscopically measure the bottom of the seafloor if it's not too turbid. So that's just one technology that we're using to try and map the seafloor, and then the ship would do the deep areas.
So I'm interested to know how your work mapping the seafloor interacts with the governments out there that have a vested interest. They're more interested in cables that might be down there and all that kind of stuff. But
yeah, government unfortunately moves at the speed of dinosaurs that have been drinking heavily, and private sector is much more rapid. So this whole thing with satellite-derived bathymetry, using satellites to map coastal areas, they're not doing it at all. I mean, I literally am out there mapping as many parts of the coastlines of as many countries as possible to say, see what you could do, and it's not that expensive. And they're like, oh, wow, yeah, I guess it does. That's pretty cool. And then maybe 5 years from now, they'll do something. It's just so slow. So private enterprise is trying to push governments to do things that they can't do themselves and bring them along. I mean, you're seeing the same thing happen with space. I mean, if you look at what the government has built, the space launch system, it's a huge white elephant. It's an expendable booster rocket, for God's sake, and Elon is catching a booster in Texas. That's how far behind they are, not just in rockets, but in ocean science and so many other things. And it's getting worse. That's why you're seeing private individuals leading the charge technologically, doing things governments can't or won't do.
That's an interesting what do you think happened? Because the government went to the moon. They
Yep.
went there first before any private industry.
Yep.
But it seems like that their pace of development has definitely slowed, and private sector has taken over.
I think it's just the nature of bureaucracy. If you go back to ancient Rome or any other civilization, as civilizations mature, they just get larger, heavier, and more lethargic. They get more and more requirements. They become less efficient. It's a natural progression, it seems, of countries.
So those 60s is just the sweet spot for us.
Yeah, in a way. I mean, once in a while, a little revolution now and then is not a bad thing, and it can, set the clock back a little bit. But there is that inertia, and I think you're seeing that. Yes, we built the Panama Canal with government. We did the Apollo program, which is great, but something happened in the 60s, 70s, and 80s where government became concerned with other things, became much less efficient, and fortunately, technology's allowed private sector to do those things. Technology allowed certain individuals to amass the level of wealth where they could mimic what governments can do. Mm-hmm. That is very rare historically, but we're there now.
That's an interesting thought too.
Because you get scale, right?
Yeah.
Someone like Mark Zuckerberg can harness the economies of scale with information technology to personally have more wealth than some countries.
Yes. It's an interesting thought because you spend a lot of money on this project, but it isn't an incomprehensible amount. There's a lot of people that have $100 million.
Yeah, and they buy a party yacht and go hanging out in the Mediterranean. And that just sickens me. It's like, come on, have a little bit more imagination. Get out of your comfort zone. We're not put on this earth to be comfortable. And then when we get comfortable, become even more comfortable. And then when we're that comfortable, then it's like, well, I want something bigger than the next guy. For God's sake, get out of that mindset. Use your time to do something effective that advances us as a species, that even puts your own life at risk if you have to, because what's the point? None of us make it out of here alive. We are all living in a teenage horror movie.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I'll tell you what. In terms of what you can spend $100 million on, this is definitely one of the coolest things that I've ever heard of.
Oh, yeah. And it's more effective. If the government had done it, it would have cost 4 or 5 times as much. But yeah, I was amazed that I was the one that did it. I just couldn't believe it sometimes. I said, there are so many people that are so much wealthier than I am that could have done this, but they just didn't do it.
No imagination.
I guess.
So we're going to get to a Q&A in a second, but what I want to do is I want to talk about a couple. Can you just give us an idea of what you're up to now? You kind of alluded to some things that you're up to in marine exploration. You do want to do a second submersible.
Yeah, there's my exploration side, and then there's my private sector investment side. So I've discussed a little bit on the exploration side. I really want to do ocean mapping. I love that. I think it's the last great exploration on planet Earth.
And it's true exploration.
Yeah, we don't know it.
Look, we're the Adventurers Club, right? And one of the things that we always say, it's like, well, there's not a whole lot of peaks that you can climb and explore.
They are. They're just underwater.
Yes.
So, yeah.
There it is.
It's just harder.
But you found the only thing that's not explored on this planet.
Yeah, well.
And everybody's been saying it, but, nobody listens, right?
You just need more imagination. And yeah, it just gets harder. So I really want to do the mapping thing with satellites, with ships. I want to develop a new submersible. There are about 23 deep ocean trenches in the world. I've done 17. The other 6 are really bothering me. So got to do that. So on the private investor side, I do venture capital as well as private equity, but the venture stuff can be very exciting. So as you're seeing on the slide, I'm actually CEO of a biomedical company. We're trying to cure some incurable diseases using artificial viruses that can get into the human nervous system. That's a whole separate thing. We're going to FDA trials hopefully in a year. I'm an investor in Colossal Biosciences. We're trying to resurrect that animal back there, the woolly mammoth. And hopefully we'll do that in 3 or 4 years. But really, that's about developing the technology to manipulate DNA to conserve every species that exists now and may have existed in the recent past. So that's very exciting. I'm also involved in asteroid mining here in LA. I'm an investor in Astroforge, and we are sending a probe, the deepest space probe ever sent up by a commercial company will be launched next month on a Falcon 9 rocket by SpaceX to do a flyby of an asteroid that we think is heavy in metals. And from my perspective, it's not a question of when, but if we end up mining asteroids. It is an engineering problem at this point. We do not need to invent any new technologies to commercially mine asteroids. It's a cost issue and it's an engineering issue. And as Neil deGrasse Tyson said, the first trillionaire is going to be the person that figures out how to mine asteroids, because it will completely change the economics of so many things. So I'm really excited about that. And even, this is my investment philosophy, even if I blow all the money I've invested in Astroforge or any of these other high technology companies, I'll still be happy because we move the ball forward. The next group that tries to do these really hard things will be building off of what we failed at. You cannot be afraid to fail. And I'll just say to everybody out there, one thing I love about my country, that I love about American culture, especially Texan culture, we are not afraid to fail. When you fail in the United States, we take it for granted that it's not that big a deal. In fact, it's kind of a badge of honor. In so many cultures, that is not the case. Failure is failure, and it's a shame, and you don't want to do that. But that's what makes us such a dynamic and energetic people, and I hope we never lose that.
Well, I'd like to open up to questions. Lance is going to pass this mic around. I'm sure people have a lot of questions, but please wait for Lance to get you the mic. You ready? You get grilled?
Oh,
No,
trust
this is a tough crowd.
I've done worse. I've had worse. Sir.
Hi, thank you. I was very curious about the mapping, right? So you said at some point you more or less get dropped in around the place where you want to land.
Right.
And then you have the three auxiliary things that probably you're triangulating with. But how are you really accurately going where you want to go? You spend a few hours there, but there is a challenge in even knowing where you are, because you have no external reference. There is no GPS, except for the mapping that you have done previously, which...
Now, I'll tell you how. It's an acoustic GPS system, and it took us a couple of years to perfect. The ship on the surface of the ocean, we knew exactly where it was because it had precision GPS. You send down the landers. The landers land on the seafloor. We have a pretty good idea of what the topology is because the sonar built the map. Then the ship cruises around in a circle for several hours, and it is acoustically pinging each lander. So we're able to triangulate where the landers are on the sonar map to pretty good precision, within 10, 20 meters. Okay, now we know where they are. Then the submarine goes down. The submarine can ping the ship and the individual landers. So in 3 dimensions, using mathematics, we can roughly triangulate where the submarine is in 3 dimensions.
I feel like
That had never been done before.
the
It's pretty
4
cool.
points, though, you're really cutting it close. You didn't want to add a fifth? Because with four satellites, effectively,
Four
like
worked well enough. It's a big ocean.
But that's
And,
the minimum. 4 is the minimum
well-
required to get your fix.
Well, we also figured out, when you drop the submersible from the surface to the bottom of Challenger Deep, it was 7 miles. We did it so many times, we actually figured out roughly how much drift we would get, and we did it with the landers as well. In
Yeah.
fact, there's a quick story where on the second dive to the Mariana Trench, one of the landers went to the bottom, and when we all got back to the surface, one of the landers was stuck on the bottom. And we were like, oh, crap. It's going to run out of power. We're not going to know where it is. I will have lost a $500,000 lander. But then we said, wait a second. We have a submersible, and we can go look for it. I said, but how are we going to find it? We came up with a solution where we knew where we dropped it. So we took another one of the landers and dropped it at exactly the same place. And of course, it didn't land right on top of the other one. It drifted. But we figured we'll then home the submersible on the new lander and then do a search pattern around it. And sure enough, within 30 minutes, we locked onto the lost lander, found it, nudged it, and it came up.
How much do one of those
That's
landers
the
worth?
deepest salvage operation in human history, and always will be,
So how
because
much-
it was at the bottom of the Challenger
How
deep.
much did you save by not having to replace the
Oh,
lander?
$500,000, yeah.
$500,000
Yeah.
lander. Huh?
And it had the one of the 3 Omega watches that were designed for full ocean depth. So that was another motivation for. So that watch has been down at the bottom of the ocean more than any other watch in history.
All right, we got one over here.
2 questions, if I may.
Sure.
What's the team, your de-extinction team, what is the plan for air gap redundancy to keep it out of AI hands? And then your opinion on this madness pursuit of going to Mars versus colonizing the deep oceans as an anti-extinction event for humans?
Okay, 2 very different questions. The first one, Colossal Biosciences has an extensive number of people that are bioethicists, genetic engineers. The chief technology officer is Dr. George Church from Harvard, who is one of the founders of the Human Genome Project. This is a very serious, very large organization that is constantly interacting with the government of how to make sure that what we're doing is ethically sound, that is going to be high integrity, and if you want anyone doing this, you want this organization. At least that's what I believe. I'm biased because I'm an investor. But this is a world-class team, and we don't think anyone is even remotely close to what they're doing. We've already had 3 spin-off companies from Colossal because of the technological tools that we're developing. A side thing that they've thrown off is a company that I'm also invested in, which is developing bioluminescent plants, right? These are plants. This isn't theoretical. I've been in the lab and seen these things. I have seen plants that are bioluminescent. That's crazy. That's Avatar level stuff. Anyway, okay, second question was, Mars. Okay, colonizing the ocean, I still don't get it. I know there are a couple of groups that are interested in colonizing the ocean. Living in the ocean is really hard. Anyone that wants to do anything in the ocean, I don't think fully appreciates how ultimately brutal the ocean is. It systematically has a will to destroy anything put in it. It's corrosive salt water. The energy in waves in the ocean is unbelievable. So if you want to go in the ocean and live there, that's kind of like saying, let's go build a new house in the Palisades. I don't know if it's the best idea. The other thing is that the ocean is still on planet Earth. Hey, I've been in 2 tornadoes in Texas. I know what it's like. Okay. So going to Mars is about allowing us to not be 100% exposed on this rock. I think that's one of the big motivations of Elon and others that want to go to Mars, is to get us off this one vulnerable potential asteroid strike kind of place, so that we have an ability to preserve our species in a place other than planet Earth. I think it's going to be a hell of a lot harder than people think it will be. Most of the people that go there are not going to come back in the first 50 years. They're going to die of radiation probably. But that's just my view. I still think it's worth doing. And yeah, if Elon asked me to go and be one of the first colonists on Mars and not come back, yeah, I'd do it.
Nice.
Victor, back here.
I'm going to die anyway. Come on.
I've heard you talk in podcast interviews as well as in your book. You mentioned that most people...
I've never written a book.
The book written about your
Okay.
exploration. That most people fail to live to their full potential.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, what do you think is the biggest impediment to achieving your full potential? And ultimately, how do you know that you're on the path to achieving your potential?
Okay. I firmly believe that that's true, that the vast majority of people come nowhere near their full potential of what they can do in their lives. Okay. The 2 major reasons they do not, okay, let me give 3. There are 3. And they're the words that are almost like, that cannot be said. Laziness, fear, and lack of self-discipline. Okay? Human beings are creatures of comfort. We just want to survive. And when we get to a nice level of comfort, gosh, so much is lost. So we become lazy. And a lot of people are lazy, you know? And then there's fear. Huge fear of failure. Huge fear of not doing the right thing, of wasting resources. And people are inherently fearful. And then the last, I think the greatest virtue that a human being can have is self-discipline. If you can control your mind and how your mind thinks, you can do anything, pretty much. You just have to point it on where you want to go. People ask me how I could do so much. I just decided to do these things. I wasn't afraid of failure, and I saw them through. And it's persistence that gets you through all that. But really, it starts with self-discipline. If you can control your mind, you can control your reality. That's from my favorite science fiction book of all time, Dune. That's a fundamental precept of that whole series. Control your mind, and you can do extraordinary things. But
Great.
we are too lazy to train our minds. Shocker, I'm a Zen Buddhist, but okay.
Go ahead, back here.
Fear is the mind killer. Are you aware of a company called Saildrone, and what would you say is the state of the art of subsurface navigation mapping?
Sure, I'm very familiar with Saildrone. I've looked at Saildrone as a possible solution for mapping the seafloor, but there are two issues with Saildrones, in my view, and I'm sure they would disagree. One is they're very expensive because they're fully autonomous. So you have to put a lot of very complex and expensive electronics into them. They are also relatively small compared to a surface vessel, so the sonar that you can put on their bottom and power with solar panels is relatively limited. That's why I'm designing and building a minimally crewed manned vessel or crewed vessel that has one or two people to basically be a minder, and it comes and goes out of port, but it has an EM-124 sonar, the biggest and most complex sonar you can put on a civilian vessel. So it can map tons more than a sail drone, and frankly, it's very cost efficient. It was designed for fuel efficiency. So when you do the cost per square kilometer mapped, because I'm a business guy, reduce it all to cost per square kilometer, it's cheaper, and it's more reliable, and pirates won't take it on the high seas and strip it for parts. That's my view of sail drone. I think sail drones will be really good in mid-coastal areas where you can't do satellite-derived bathymetry at 30 meters, but a deep ocean vessel is not efficient at 100 meters. I think sail drones would be great between 30 and 200 meters. So, like so many things in life, the combination of technologies is the ultimate solution, not the silver bullet. Why is it that Americans are so obsessed with silver bullets on like everything?
Back here, back here,
Yeah,
Richard.
it's simple, and we're a simple people. Okay, fair enough.
So this is a bit of a two-part question. So how long would the distance would it take, or how long would it take for you to get from the surface down to the bottom of the ocean? And is it an active sort of activity that you're sort of engaged the entire time, or could you put on cruise control? And if it took a long time, what would you do to entertain yourself? You're by yourself for however long it would take you to get to the bottom.
Okay, that was 3 questions, but okay. So first, it would typically, to go to the very bottom of the ocean, it would take 4.5 hours from the surface to the bottom of Challenger Deep. We typically would spend anywhere between 2 and 4 hours at the bottom, and then come back up in 4 hours. Yes, there was an autopilot on the sub. There wasn't initially. So going down is not big of a problem. You were kind of just drifting down, and it was really just making sure that the instruments were saying what you wanted them to say, make sure the batteries weren't leaking, all sorts of stuff. It was just like, monitoring a panel when you're in the military submarine. When you get to the bottom, you're very busy. You're trying to stay just off the surface, you're going in different directions, you're trying to track a course, you're looking. The joke was, on the descent, a minute feels like 5, because you just want to get to the bottom. When you're on the bottom, a minute seems like a second, because you're so busy and so much is going on, and it's so cool and so fascinating. And a minute going up is like an hour, because you just want to get back to the surface. So by the time we had been diving the submarine for about 4 years, it got to the point where on the descent, I was getting course updates from the surface saying, hey, you're drifting, 50 meters to the north, correct back. And I would get on the thrusters and move the sub back so it was in a straight line. So we got really good at that. But it was not that active. But autopilot helped a lot when you're on the bottom, especially with heading control. And on the way back up, I noticed, especially when I had a passenger, like a scientist, people would start getting antsy. And so we would have in-flight movies. And I would let the passenger select the movie on the way back up. So at the Titanic, we watched the Titanic. At Challenger Deep, on my way back up from the first dive, I watched The Abyss by Jim Cameron. And other people wanted to watch, other dramas. Kathy Sullivan, the first woman at the bottom, we watched The Man Who Would Be King on the way back up. So yeah, we would entertain ourselves. And I did have a tradition, whenever I got to the bottom of the ocean, I would have a tuna fish sandwich, because it was appropriate.
Now, I have a quick follow-up. Before you developed the in-flight movies, did you ever just stare into the abyss to see how long you could look into the blackness? Did you ever flirt with the abyss?
It was kind of weird, actually, if you just, cup your eyes on the portal looking out into ultimate blackness. Yeah, it kind of got weird. I have to confess, kind of spooky. I will say there was a really cool thing that we discovered kind of by accident. Between about 1,000 and 3,000 meters, I'll never forget the first time it happened. I was going down and I was checking something and I bumped the light controls and all the lights came up and I went, oh shit, that's a lot of battery power. So I turned them off. I looked out the portal and this massive wave of bioluminescence started lighting up off in the distance. It was like lightning in the ocean. I went, holy crap. And then, of course, the scientists went, well, yeah, that's the most common form of communication on planet Earth is aquatic bioluminescence. I went, okay, well, you should have told me. It's really cool. So after that, it never happened all the time, but about 30 or 40% of the time, when you got in that zone, the midnight zone, I'd get all the lights off, and then I'd turn all of them on at once, and then turn them off again. And so many times you'd see them all flash back. It was almost like, you're yelling, hey! And they're like going, what?
I mean,
I have no idea what I was saying, but
just that's an endless amount of science.
yeah.
One flash, two flashes,
I
three
guess,
flashes, whatever,
yeah.
different colors. Like you could go.
Yeah, like
that's
Close
it.
Encounters. God knows where that would have led. But
All right, we got one back here.
Is there any exploration of utilizing the ocean's corrosive capabilities to create some sort of energy source?
Possibly. I don't think it's ever. God knows people have studied so many ways to try and get energy from the ocean, whether it's tidal systems or one way that actually is pretty effective that I know DARPA is working on is actually the heat differential between the different layers that actually can generate electricity. Using the corrosive nature of the ocean, unfortunately, that would probably require a consumable part of that system, which would make it economically inefficient. So the answer is technically, could you do it? Maybe. Would it be economically efficient? Probably not. Heat differential is probably the way to go.
What's interesting about that is getting back to bias, right? Like we're familiar with plants and photosynthesis. We can effectively, grow some algae and make some biodiesel.
Mm-hmm.
You found bacteria on the bottom of the ocean that are converting energy from that corrosive nature
Yeah.
of everything, but we're just so far removed from it that you never.
It always comes back down to the math. What is the chemical efficiency of photosynthesis? It's really low. It's like 3%, okay?
Yeah.
Photovoltaic cells are like between 12 and 20. So the issue is just because you can do something doesn't mean it's economically efficient. And
Yeah.
just because something can be done in a laboratory certainly does not mean it can be done in the real world at scale.
And those bacteria are living a pretty meager existence on the bottom.
Exactly. And that's why you don't see huge algae farms to create biodiesel because it's economically inefficient. So that's
Spoken like a true Texan.
No, spoken like a true venture capitalist.
Right.
Most people don't realize in the realm of venture capital, 9 out of 10 of your investments are ending up zeros or not that good. It's the 1 in 10 that you got right that pays for all the others. Because going from theory to the lab is hard enough. And then they actually call it the valley of death. How do you get from the lab to commercially scalable, economically profitable, which means it's efficient, that it works, system? And it's really hard because the world is unpredictable. You don't know what you don't know. And that's why even with all the brain power we had building the limiting factor, we still didn't know half the stuff that was going to go wrong. I also hold the record for the deepest fire in a submersible. Okay? That happened at the Tonga Trench at 10,800 meters. It was the first dive to the Tonga Trench. I was down there on the bottom for 15 minutes. I was quiet, I was exploring, and all of a sudden, all hell broke loose. Alarm after alarm, lights flashing. I was alone in the sub. I was 4 hours from the surface. I'm like, okay. And then the first thing that goes through your mind is, okay, what is causing this massive cascade of failures? I guessed right, and it was a battery. A battery had gotten some saltwater ingress, and it was melting down. It was dumping a couple of kilovolts into the system, and it was melting the submarine right outside the pressure capsule. So I shut it down, and I tried to isolate it before it could bleed into all the other circuits and cause a complete failure. So that happened, and I came back up and had probably the strangest radio call I've ever had when I was doing my diving, which was, they said, okay, Victor, hey, you're back on the surface. We've got you on the hook. We're lifting you back up onto the ship. All is good. But you should know when we open the hatch, you're going to smell a lot of burning stuff. I went, great. They said, yeah, when you breached the surface, the fire started again. I went, oh, thanks. Okay. And so we solved that problem.
The fire was probably always
but-
burning the whole time, right?
But
Yeah.
but the fire showed where the weak point in the sub was.
Yeah.
So we went hard after that for the next month, and we solved that problem. But that's what you.
What was
we
the
did-
battery
we did-
chemistry
We
that
didn't
you were
know it
using?
was. It was a lithium polymer. But the issue was the gasket that allowed the circuit to come in and out, and it was corroding much faster than we expected. There was some other really technical stuff that went into it, but it was something we could not foresee.
Yeah.
It really wasn't. But we found out through real world testing.
We got one back here.
You say that 75% of the ocean is unmapped. Do you think there's a chance that we'll find any artifacts of human civilizations that we don't even know about through the mapping that you plan to accomplish?
Mapping, no. Because unfortunately, sonar, people don't often get this. You can't tell the difference between rocks and metal. People kept asking me to search for Malaysian flight 3 or whatever it was, 370 or whatever the number was. And the issue was sonar will just be mapping the acoustic reflections, and it can't tell the difference between rock and metal. You need to get down and look at it closely. You need an RO, a remotely operated vehicle, or you need a manned submersible to go down and look at something interesting. Is it possible that we could find a civilization like Atlantis or something, or some other subterranean, or whatever? Yeah, sure. I mean, God knows, I was so looking forward to finding an alien ship at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. That would have been awesome. I could have told James, yeah, your movie came true. But anyway, mapping won't do it. But mapping may give you a clue, and then you can go look for it. But for example, they recently thought they found Amelia Earhart's plane, right? Yeah. And they had a beautiful sonar image, and it looked like a plane. First thing I said to myself when I saw that image was, it looks too good, right? That's a plane that crashed almost 100 years ago, and it looks like a plane still. But it'll fool you, too.
Victor, I'm curious to know, you mentioned Dune as a book that has inspired you. What are some of the other books that you read when you were younger, maybe even now? Some of the things you're talking about is like Michael Crichton's Jurassic Park. I'm mostly asking because I'm making recommendations to my own son, different books that I've read. I'd be interested to know what has inspired you.
Obviously, I'm a huge fan of science fiction because I think good science fiction authors point to what could be. And then you get crazy people like me saying, well, how can we actually make that work? If something doesn't violate the laws of physics, it's a matter of engineering and resources. And science fiction often shows that. One of the first books my parents got me when I was very young was Good's World Atlas. And I just would sit there and study maps. I loved maps, just for whatever reason. So I love science fiction. I also read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne when I was very young, and look what happened. That's what I would suggest. And a little bit of fiction. Variety. Variety is good, and just encourage, at the very root core, just encourage kids to bloody read, get their heads in a book and off the screen.
We're going to take one more question back
Okay.
there.
Do you find it hard trying to balance your business mind and your explorer mind? Because to me, it feels like, a business mindset, you want to kind of have every single thing put in front of you before you go, okay, I'm ready to invest. But an explorer would be like, I got 90 to 90% odds, I'm ready to go.
No, what's extraordinary is how much they all rhyme. Business investments, extreme exploration, even war. I've actually given talks on this. They're different, but they rhyme. And where they rhyme is that they can be reduced to basic principles and math and risk analysis. So making an investment, what's the first thing you do when you make an investment? What's the first thing you do when you study a battlefield? What's the first thing you do when you're going to dive into a new place? You study the hell out of it. You gather the intelligence. In the military, they call it intelligence preparation of the battlefield. You're doing the exact same thing when you're making an investment or going on an extreme exploration. And then it becomes about adaptability. Trust me, when you invest in a company, especially in private equity, and you're doing a turnaround, things happen that you did not expect. So you have to adapt and change and do the best you can. Same thing happens on a mountain. Weather changes, you've got to adapt. And you're constantly doing, if you're doing it correctly, the math on what's the risk, what's the reward, what's my escape plan. In business, what's my escape plan if everything goes to hell? Can I get at least my money back? How do I do that? How do I ensure that? What if I'm in a dive and all of a sudden the battery gets on fire? How do I get home? all those disciplines. Flying is a great discipline. I'm a huge believer in trying to get young people into cockpits because I think it teaches so many different skills about risk analysis, planning, knowing machinery, getting self-confidence. And I actually give a lot of money to the Association of Pilots in the US because I want to get more and more kids into cockpits. So anyway.
Well, thank you for joining us, Victor.
Thank you very much.
For those of you watching online, as a reminder, we do this every Thursday at the Adventurers Club. So thank you for tuning in. But other than that, again, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's been an honor having you here. But that's all for us here at the Adventurers Club of Los Angeles. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.